The cold was the first thing that registered. It was not the biting chill of a broken air conditioning unit, but the raw, unforgiving frost of a world completely untouched by civilization. Arthur opened his eyes. Or rather, Cale opened his eyes. Two lifetimes violently collided in a mind built for only one. Arthur Vance was a senior materials engineer and weapons systems designer for a top-tier defense contractor in the 21st century. His last memory was the blinding, searing flash of a laboratory explosion. Then there was Cale, a scrawny, 15-year-old gatherer of the Black Rock tribe who had just been thrown against a stone wall by a panicked beast of burden. Cale clutched his forehead. His fingers came away covered in crimson. He sat up, his vision blurring as he took in the chaotic scene. Mud huts with thatched roofs of dried grass burned in the distance. Men and women clothed in poorly cured animal hides were running in absolute terror. The roar that shook the settlement belonged to a razorback, a prehistoric monstrosity resembling a boar but the size of a modern rhinoceros. It was covered in thick layers of hardened mud that acted like armor, and it bristled with bone-piercing quills. The tribe's hunters were failing miserably. Their crude, flint-tipped spears merely scratched the beast's mud armor before snapping in two. The chief, a heavily scarred brute named Throck, was bleeding from a massive gash on his leg, desperately waving a heavy wooden club to keep the monster at bay. "Fools," Arthur muttered. The voice that came out was Cale's raspy adolescent tone, strange to his own ears. "You're attacking its center of mass where the armor is thickest, and your weapons completely lock the kinetic energy to penetrate it." The memories of young Cale whispered that this was the end. The Black Rock tribe would be slaughtered. But the mind of Arthur Vance, a man who designed ballistics capable of piercing depleted uranium tank armor, refused to die at the tusks of a feral, overgrown pig. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his skull. His engineer's eyes scanned the primitive environment, instantly breaking the chaotic world down into raw materials, physics, and variables. Wood, stone, sinew, leverage, velocity. He grabbed a discarded spear from the dirt. The shaft was sturdy, made of straight ashwood, but it was far too heavy for Cale's weak, malnourished arms to throw with lethal force. He needed a force multiplier. Nearby lay a thick, broken branch with a natural hardened notch at one end and a spool of dried animal gut used for tying hides. In seconds, his fingers, guided by Cale's muscle memory for tying knots and Arthur's deep understanding of mechanical leverage, fashioned an atlatl. It was a primitive spear thrower, a simple tool that acted as an artificial extension of the throwing arm. By effectively adding a third joint to the arm, it could drastically increase a projectile's launch velocity and kinetic energy. He secured the butt of the spear into the notch of the atlatl and bound it tightly. The razorback tossed a hunter aside like a rag doll and turned its bloody tusks toward Cale. It scraped its massive hooves against the dirt, preparing to charge. "Cale, run!" screamed Alara, a young girl from the Gatherer caste, crying from behind a stone barricade. Cale didn't run. He stood his ground, spreading his feet shoulder-width apart to establish a solid center of gravity. His mind raced through the calculations. Distance, 20 meters. Wind speed, negligible. Target, large but heavily armored. He needed a weak point. The eye was too small a target for an untested weapon. He looked at the anatomy, the joints, the soft tissue right behind the front shoulder blade, where the hardened mud naturally cracked when the beast extended its front legs to charge. "Come on, you prehistoric bacon," Cale whispered, his eyes cold and calculated. The beast charged. The ground trembled beneath Cale's bare feet. 10 meters, 8. Cale stepped forward, transferring his body weight perfectly from his back foot to his front. He whipped his arm forward in a fluid, vicious arc. The atlatl snapped forward, extending his leverage to be absolute maximum. Thwack. The ashwood spear didn't just fly, it blurred. Powered by the mechanical advantage of the atlatl, it struck with the force of an early black powder firearm. The flint tip slammed precisely into the crease behind the beast's shoulder blade, shattering the ribs and driving deep into its heart and lungs. The razorback shrieked, a deafening sound that quickly dissolved into a wet gurgle. Its massive momentum carried it forward, skidding across the dirt and crashing to a halt just inches from Cale's toes. Dead. A profound silence descended upon the Black Rock tribe. The biting wind howled through the canyon, but the people were utterly still. They stared wide-eyed at the scrawny dwarf who had just felled a demon beast with a single, thunderous strike. Chief Throck went forward, leaning heavily on his club. He looked at the massive dead beast, to the strange hooked stick in Cale's hand. What magic is this boy? Cale looked at the crude tool in his hand, then at the awestruck, terrified faces of his people. He remembered the modern world, skyscrapers piercing the clouds, fighter jets breaking the sound barrier, the blinding glow of a blast furnace pouring rivers of molten steel. This world was savage, brutal, and primitive, but it was incredibly rich in untouched resources, and its people were a blank slate. "It's not magic, Chief," Cale said, his voice steady, carrying a heavy, commanding authority the boy had never possessed. "It's physics." He looked up at the harsh, alien sky. He had survived his first hour. Next came improved fire, then agriculture, then bronze, iron, and eventually black powder and steel. He would not just survive in this savage world. With the knowledge of 1,000 generations locked in his mind, he would forge these primitives into an unstoppable clan. He would give them weapons of unimaginable power,
He would conquer this world, and he would be its god.
The word physics meant absolutely nothing to Chief Throck. To the battle-scarred leader of the Blackrock tribe, the scrawny boy standing before the dead Razorback had just spoken gibberish. Yet, the mountain of bleeding meat at Cale's feet was an undeniable reality. Throck grabbed the atlatl from Cale's hand, inspecting the crude piece of notched wood. He swung it clumsily. "A broken stick," Throck grunted, his deep voice rumbling in his chest. "You killed a Razorback with a broken stick and a boy's throwing arm." "It's an extension of the arm, Chief," Cale explained, keeping his tone respectful but firm. He knew the body he inhabited was weak. He needed Throck's muscle and authority to keep the tribe together while he enacted his plans. "It provides leverage. It makes the spear fly faster and hit harder." Throck scowled, tossing the atlatl back to Cale. "Magic, leverage, whatever word you use, boy, it fills bellies. Tonight, the tribe eats." A ragged cheer went up from the surviving tribe's people. Starvation was a constant shadow over the Blackrock tribe, and a beast this size meant they wouldn't have to forage for bitter roots for weeks. As the hunters moved in with their crude, chipped flint knives to butcher the carcass, Cale stepped forward, raising his hands. "Wait!" The hunters paused, looking to Throck. Before today, a gatherer boy interrupting a hunter's work would have earned a swift backhand. Today, they hesitated. "You are hacking at it blindly," Cale said, approaching the massive carcass. He took a heavy, jagged flint blade from a confused hunter named Gore. Cale tested the edge. It was pitiful, barely a step above a broken rock. "You're ruining the hide, shattering the bones, and wasting the fat. We need all of it." Arthur Vance had never butchered an animal by hand in his past life, but as an engineer, he understood anatomy and biomechanics. Ligaments, joints, and muscle groups were just biological hinges, pulleys, and structural supports. Cale knelt by the beast. "Gore, hold the leg back. Keep the tension high." As the burly hunter pulled the massive leg, Cale didn't hack. Instead, he used the poor flint edge to slice precisely through the taut connective tissue of the hip joint. The heavy leg popped free with a sickening squelch, requiring a fraction of the effort the hunters usually expended. Gasps murmured through the gathered crowd. Alara, the young gatherer girl who had yelled for him earlier, watched with wide, observant eyes. "Don't strike the bones," Cale instructed, handing the knife back to Gore. "Cut the bindings holding them together, and when you strip the hide, leave a layer of fat on it. I need the fat." "Fat goes in the fire to make it bright, or we eat it," an elder woman croaked from the back. "Not this time," Cale replied, wiping the blood from his hands. "The meat is for the tribe, but the thickest bones, the fat, and the stomach lining belong to me." Throck stepped forward, towering over Cale. "You demand a hunter's share, boy?" "I demand an inventor's share," Cale said, meeting the chief's gaze without flinching. "Give me what I ask, and I will give the tribe something better than meat." Throck stared down at the boy. The eyes looking back at him were not the eyes of a frightened 15-year-old. They were cold, calculating, and impossibly old. Throck gave a slow nod. "Give the boy his scraps." As the sun began to dip behind the jagged mountain peaks, the canyon grew dangerously cold. The tribe gathered in the center of the settlement to light the communal fire. Cale watched as the tribe's firekeeper, an old man with calloused, bleeding hands, frantically rubbed a straight stick between his palms against a piece of dry hardwood. It was a hand drill, the most primitive and exhausting method of friction fire. 10 minutes passed and only a wisp of smoke appeared before the old man collapsed, coughing and exhausted. "Move," Cale said, stepping into the circle. He had gathered his spoils, a curved rib bone from the Razorback, a tough strip of sinew, a hollowed-out knuckle bone, and some dry moss. Cale quickly tied the sinew to both ends of the curved rib, creating a small, rigid bow. He looped the string once around the straight wooden spindle the old man had been using. Then he placed the bone knuckle on top of the spindle to hold it down without burning his hand. The tribe watched in baffled silence. Cale pressed down on the bone socket and began to saw the bow back and forth. The mechanical advantage was immediate. The spindle spun at 10 times the speed a human hand could achieve, driven by the rhythmic, effortless pushing and pulling of the bow. In less than 20 seconds, a thick plume of white smoke erupted from the friction point. A glowing red coal formed in the dust. Cale gently tapped the coal into a nest of dry moss and blew softly. Whoosh! A bright orange flame leapt to life, illuminating the stunned faces of the Blackrock tribe. What usually took hours of agonizing labor had been achieved by the boy in moments. "Fire," Alara whispered, kneeling close to the warmth, looking at Cale as if he had pulled the sun from the sky. Cale fed a few twigs into the flame, his mind already moving 10 steps ahead. The bow drill and the atlatl were just simple physics, child's play, but they had established his worth. He was no longer just Cale the Gatherer, he was Cale the Creator. He looked around the fire at his tribe, 50 people, malnourished, clad in rotting furs, wielding sticks and stones. Tomorrow he would use the animal fat and wood ash to create lye, and from that, basic soap. Disease and infection were the biggest killers here. Basic hygiene would save more lives than a dozen hunters. Then he would use the beast's stomach lining to create a bellows, because to rule this world he needed metal, and to get metal he needed a fire much, much hotter than this one.
Cale looked into the dancing flames, the reflection of the fire burning fiercely in his eyes. The Stone Age was
The morning sun cast a pale, weak light over the Blackrock settlement, but the mood was brighter than it had been in seasons. For the first time in Cale's 15 years of memory, the tribe was waking up with full stomachs. Cale, however, had not slept. The mind of Arthur Vance was too loud, too busy calculating the monumental task ahead. By dawn, Cale had set up a crude workstation at the edge of the camp. He had taken the largest clay pot the tribe owned, a fragile, poorly fired vessel that leaked if left full too long, and placed it over a small, controlled fire. "What are you making?" Cale looked up to see Alara. The young gatherer girl was watching him from a few paces away, hugging a ragged fur around her shoulders to ward off the morning chill. "Survival," Cale said simply. He gestured to a hollowed-out log nearby. He had pierced a small hole in its bottom, packed it with a layer of dried grass for filtration, and filled it with white hardwood ashes from last night's fire. He was currently pouring water over the ashes, letting it drip slowly through the hole into a wooden bowl beneath. "It looks like dirty water," Alara noted, her nose wrinkling. "It's lye water," Cale corrected, though he knew the word meant nothing to her. The water leaching through the wood ash was extracting potassium hydroxide. "It's dangerous on its own. It burns the skin. But when you mix it with the right amount of melted fat." He poured the yellowish lye water into the clay pot over the fire, where chunks of the razorback's fat were already melting into a greasy liquid. As the mixture began to boil, Cale stirred it continuously with a wooden paddle. It smelled atrocious, a pungent, heavy odor of rendered fat and caustic ash. But as he stirred, the magic of chemistry began to happen. The liquid slowly thickened, transforming into a frothy, yellowish paste. Saponification. He had made primitive soap. "It smells like death," a harsh, raspy voice sneered. Cale turned to see Malachur, the tribe's shaman, marching toward him. Malachur was a gaunt man draped in wolf skins, his face painted with streaks of striking blue-green mud. Following closely behind the shaman was Chief Throck, leaning heavily on a spear. Throck's leg, where the razorback had gored him yesterday, was swollen and radiating an angry, dark red heat. "The boy cooks fat with ash," Malachur mocked, addressing the chief. "He wastes good food. His trick with the flying stick was a fluke of the wind. He is no hunter. He is touched by mad spirits." Throck grimaced, fresh sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. He looked at Cale. "The shaman says the rot spirit has entered my leg. He goes to pack it with the sacred earth to draw it out." Cale looked at the wooden bowl in Malachur's hands. It was filled with mud collected from the riverbank, stagnant, bacteria-ridden sludge. "If you put that on his leg, he will be dead in 3 days," Cale stated flatly. Malachur snarled, stepping forward. "You dare question the spirits, boy?" "I don't care about spirits," Cale replied, lifting his clay pot off the fire using a pair of thick leather scraps. He set it down to cool. "I care about infection. That mud is full of bacteria. The rot spirit isn't a curse, Chief. It's tiny, invisible bugs eating your flesh because the wound is filthy." Throck hesitated. He respected Malachur's position, but Cale had brought down the beast that fed them all. "What is your answer then, boy?" Cale scooped up a handful of the semi-solid yellowish paste he had just created. It was soft soap, crude but highly alkaline, a death sentence for most bacteria. He grabbed a skin of clean water that he had boiled earlier and cooled. "Hold him," Cale instructed Gore, the burly hunter who had accompanied them. Over Malachur's furious protests, Cale went to work. He washed his own hands thoroughly first. Then, he applied the soap directly to Throck's festering wound, scrubbing away the dried blood, dirt, and pus, before flushing it completely with the sterilized water. Throck roared in pain, his massive muscles tensing as the caustic soap stung the open flesh, but he didn't pull away. "The redness will fade by tomorrow," Cale promised, binding the clean wound with a strip of boiled leather. "Keep it dry. No mud." Throck breathed heavily, nodding slowly. "The pain is sharp, but the heavy, deep burning is gone. It feels clean." He glared at Malachur. "We will try the boy's way." Furious and humiliated, Malachur spat at Cale's feet. "You mock the sacred ways. The spirits will turn the earth against you." As the shaman spun around to storm off, Cale's eyes locked onto the blue-green streaks of paint on Malachur's cheek. Arthur's encyclopedic knowledge of geology flared to life. "Wait," Cale commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Even Malachur paused at the sheer authority in the boy's tone. Cale stepped up to the shaman and boldly wiped a finger across the man's painted cheek. The pigment came off on Cale's skin, a vibrant, powdery cyan. "Where did you get this?" Cale asked, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. "The Weeping Caves, half a day's walk toward the setting sun," Malachur spat, pulling away. "The walls are covered in the sacred green dirt. It is for the shaman alone." Cale looked at his fingertip, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. It wasn't just dirt. It was malachite, copper carbonate hydroxide. It was a high-grade copper ore, sitting right on the surface, waiting to be taken. He had expected to spend months searching for usable ore, but this tribe had been using it as makeup. Cale turned to Throck, his eyes gleaming with a fierce, terrifying intelligence. "Chief, Give me 5 strong men and baskets. Tomorrow, we go to the Weeping Caves. For the shaman's dirt, Throck asked, bewildered. What use is green dirt to a hunter? Because, Throck, Cale whispered, looking at the crude stone spear in the chief's hand. Stone shatters. Bone breaks. Wood rots. Cale clenched his fist, feeling the powdery copper ore on his skin. I am going to teach you how to make something that does not break. The trek to the Weeping Caves took half the day, just as Malachar had said. Cale's 15-year-old body ached with every step, his muscles burning from the unaccustomed exertion, but the iron will of Arthur Vance drove him forward. Accompanying him was Gore, the massive hunter, and 3 other able-bodied tribesmen. They carried heavy woven baskets and crude stone mauls, casting nervous glances at the sky. Being away from the settlement meant exposure to predators, but Chief Throck's orders were absolute. The chief's leg was already showing miraculous signs of healing thanks to Cale's soap, cementing the boys' strange new authority. When they pushed through a dense thicket of thorny vines, the caves finally came into view. Cale stopped, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't just a cave. It was an exposed cliff face where ancient tectonic activity had violently thrust a mineral vein straight to the surface. Water trickled down the rock, oxidizing the exposed minerals and staining the entire cliff side a brilliant, vivid cyan. The weeping green, Gore muttered, touching an amulet of bone at his neck. Malachar says spirits bleed here. Spirits don't bleed, Gore, Cale said, stepping up to the rock face. He ran his hand over the crumbly, green striated stone. The earth does, and she's bleeding malachite. It was a staggering deposit of copper carbonate. In his old world, a surface yield this rich would have started a corporate war. Here, it was used to paint a madman's face. Smash it, Cale ordered, pointing to the thickest veins. Don't bother with the gray rock. I only want the green. Break it into pieces small enough to carry, and fill every basket. For the next several hours, the canyon echoed with the rhythmic, dull thuds of stone smashing against stone. Gore and the hunters grumbled at the bizarre labor, sweating under the afternoon sun as they chipped away the heavy green rocks. By the time they returned to the Blackrock settlement, the sun was dipping low. Cale didn't rest. He had spent the previous afternoon preparing for this exact moment. In the center of the camp, Cale had constructed a strange, dome-shaped mound out of mud, clay, and dried river grass. It stood waist-high, with a chimney hole at the top and a small opening at the base. Inserted into the base opening was a hollowed-out branch packed in clay to resist heat. Attached to the other end of that wooden pipe was Cale's masterpiece, the stomach lining of the razorback, cured quickly over smoke, stitched tight with sinew, and stretched over a collapsible wooden frame. What is that monster? Alara asked, stepping cautiously around the strange clay tower. A bloomery furnace, Cale replied, wiping sweat and green dust from his forehead. And a bag bellows. He directed Gore to dump the malachite into a stone mortar and start crushing it into coarse gravel. Meanwhile, Cale filled the clay furnace with charcoal he had spent the night baking in a covered dirt pit. Gore, Cale called out, taking the crushed green gravel and pouring it directly into the top of the furnace, layering it with more charcoal. Come here. Grab this wooden handle on the bag. Gore stepped up, looking at the contraption with deep suspicion. Push down, then pull up. Steadily, Cale instructed. Gore pushed. The heavy animal bladder compressed, forcing a massive rush of air through the wooden pipe and directly into the base of the furnace. Cale dropped a glowing ember from the communal fire down the chimney. Again, Gore. Keep pumping. Don't stop. As Gore pumped the bellows, the fire inside the clay dome roared to life. The forced oxygen acted like a supercharger. The smoke billowing from the top turned thick and black, then cleared as the heat skyrocketed. The orange glow visible through the air intake shifted to yellow, and then, impossibly, to a blinding, painful white. The tribe gathered around, keeping a fearful distance. They had never felt heat like this. It pushed them back, baking the air itself. Arthur's mind ran the chemical equations. Malachite was a carbonate. At extreme heat, the carbon from the charcoal would bond with the oxygen in the ore, stripping it away and venting it as carbon dioxide. What would be left behind, melting and pooling at the bottom of the furnace, was pure, elemental copper. Faster, Gore, Cale shouted over the roaring flames. They kept at it for 2 agonizing hours. Gore was drenched in sweat, his massive arms trembling from the repetitive strain, but he didn't dare stop as Cale watched the color of the flames with an obsessive, manic intensity. Stop, Cale finally commanded. Gore collapsed backward, gasping for air. Cale took a thick wooden pole, soaking its tip in a bucket of water, and stepped up to the base of the blistering hot furnace. With a fierce thrust, he smashed the clay plug holding the bottom closed. A collective gasp swept through the tribe. Even Chief Throck, limping forward, went wide-eyed. From the bottom of the furnace, a stream of liquid fire poured out into a shallow depression Cale had dug in the sand. It glowed with a terrifying, radiant luminescence, a heavy, viscous fluid that illuminated the twilight camp in a harsh, alien light. Water, Cale demanded. Alara hurried forward, pouring a skin of water over the glowing pool. Steam erupted violently, hissing like a nest of angry vipers. When the steam cleared, the glowing liquid fire had solidified. In the sand lay a rough, heavy lump of metal, gleaming with a dull, reddish-brown luster. Cale used 2 flat pieces of wood like tongs to pull the hot lump from the sand. He carried it to a large, flat boulder he had designated as an anvil. Taking a smooth, dense river stone in his hand, he raised it high and brought it down on the copper bloom. Clang! The metallic ringing sound shattered the silence of the Stone Age. It was a sound this world had never heard. Cale struck it again, and again, and again. Pure copper was soft, easily shaped while hot, and striking it repeatedly compressed its crystalline structure, work-hardening it. Under his rhythmic blows, the shapeless lump slowly flattened, elongated, and took on a distinct, lethal geometry. He plunged it into a bucket of water one last time. Hiss! Cale pulled it out and wiped off the ash. It was a crude dagger, about 8 inches long. The edges weren't razor-sharp yet, but it was smooth, solid, and completely unnatural to the eyes of the primitives. Chief Throck stepped forward, mesmerized. Cale flipped the blade and held the handle out to the chief. Throck took it hesitantly. He expected it to be brittle like flint or light like bone. Instead, it was terrifyingly heavy. Throck pressed the edge of the copper dagger against the shaft of his thick, hardwood spear. With a firm push, the metal bit deeply into the wood, shearing off a clean, smooth slice of ash. Throck dropped his spear. He looked at the shaved wood, then at the glowing metal blade, and finally at Cale. The awe in the chief's eyes bordered on religious terror. "It does not chip," Throck whispered. "It does not shatter. It is called metal, Chief," Cale said, his voice echoing in the dead silence of the camp. He looked past Throck, locking eyes with the furious, terrified shaman, Malachur, who lurked in the shadows. "And with it," Cale declared, "the Blackrock tribe will never run from a beast, or a rival clan, ever again." The copper dagger was a marvel to the Blackrock tribe, but to Arthur Vance, it was already a disappointment. The morning after the first smelt, Cale sat by the ashes of the bloomery furnace, running his thumb over the edge of the blade. Gore, the burly hunter, had spent an hour hacking at deadwood to test it. The weapon hadn't shattered like flint, but its edge had curled and dulled significantly. Pure copper was too soft. It was a stepping stone, nothing more. To make weapons capable of piercing the hardened mud armor of a razorback or the shields of rival tribes, he needed an alloy. He needed tin to make bronze. "Chief," Cale called out to Throck, who was inspecting his rapidly healing leg. "The green dirt gave us this blade. But to make it stronger, I need a different stone. A heavy, dark rock. Sometimes it has black or brownish red crystals. You usually find it near riverbeds." Before Throck could answer, a harsh, guttural chant echoed through the canyon. From the far side of the camp, Malachur marched forward. The shaman was no longer alone. He was flanked by 4 of the tribe's elders and a dozen gatherers. Their faces were painted in streaks of white ash, the mark of mourning and fear. "The boy speaks of stones, but he brings only death," Malachur bellowed, pointing a crooked staff at Cale. "The earth bleeds. The wind howls with the voices of the angry ancestors. The green dirt was sacred to the spirits, and he has burned it in his demon fire." A murmur of genuine fear rippled through the gathered crowd. Cale noticed that even Gore took a half-step backward. To these people, the world was an incomprehensible, terrifying place ruled by invisible, capricious gods. Malachur was their only shield against that terror. Throck frowned, leaning on his spear. "The boy's fire healed my leg, Malachur. His blade cuts wood without breaking. A trick of the dark spirits to blind you, Chief." Malachur shrieked. He stepped up to the smoldering communal fire pit in the center of the camp. "The spirits of the flame have spoken to me in the night. They demand the blood of the one who stole the earth's metal, or they will scorch our hunting grounds to ash." To prove his point, Malachur reached into a leather pouch at his waist. He drew out a handful of fine, yellowish powder, the dried spores of a canyon fungus, and violently threw it into the dying embers of the fire. Whoosh! A massive, blinding fireball erupted 10 feet into the air, accompanied by a roaring sound that terrified the onlookers. Several tribespeople screamed and dropped to their knees, bowing their heads to the dirt. Even Throck flinched, raising an arm to shield his eyes. Malachur stood before the fading fireball, looking like a vengeful god. "The fire spirit demands his life. Seize the demon boy." 2 of the elders stepped forward hesitantly, holding stone clubs. Cale didn't move. He looked at the dissipating smoke, then at Malachur's triumphant, painted face. Arthur Vance had dealt with hostile corporate takeovers, military tribunals, and rival weapons contractors. A primitive con artist with a handful of flash powder was an insult to his intellect. "Like a podium powder," Cale said flatly, his voice cutting through the panic. "Or some local equivalent. High surface area to volume ratio. When dispersed in the air over an ignition source, it combusts instantly. It's a cheap parlor trick, Malachur." The shaman glared. "You speak in tongues, demon." "I speak science," Cale said, standing up. He grabbed his copper dagger and walked calmly toward the fire. The elders with clubs hesitated, intimidated by his total lack of fear. You think that was a display of power? Cale asked, his adolescent voice projecting across the silent camp. You throw dust in the fire and call yourself a master of spirits. But your magic is weak. It is an illusion. My magic, my physics, can shatter mountains. Cale walked over to a stack of forging supplies. He picked up a thick, sturdy length of hollow river cane, similar to bamboo, which the tribe used to carry water. It was sealed naturally at one joint. Cale poured water into the open end until it was half full. What are you doing? Throck asked, his voice tight with tension. Showing you the difference between a shaman and an engineer, Cale replied. He took a thick lump of wet, heavy river clay and packed it violently into the open end of the cane, sealing it shut. He wrapped the clay plug tightly with wet sinew, binding it until the cane was a perfectly sealed pressure vessel. He walked up to the fire pit, right past a sneering Malachur, and tossed the sealed cane directly into the hottest, glowing red coals at the center. Your spirit made a flash of light, Cale said, turning his back to the fire and walking toward Throck. But let me tell you about the laws of thermodynamics. When water turns to steam, its volume expands by roughly 1,700 times. When you trap that expansion inside a sealed vessel. Cale stopped and looked back at Malachur, who was staring at the cane with a confused scowl. The pressure has to go somewhere. More mad words. Malachur yelled to the crowd. He offers a wet stick to the flames. The spirits will, everyone, Cale commanded, his voice suddenly sharp as a razor. Cover your ears and open your mouths. Arthur's military instincts took over. He dropped to one knee and covered his ears, in action Throck and Gore mirrored purely out of instinct. Malachur, however, stood his ground, pointing his staff at Cale. The heat inside the coals breached the cane's threshold. The water inside flashed into steam instantly. The structural integrity of the wood failed. Boom! It wasn't a flare of fire. It was a concussive, deafening detonation. The explosion sounded like a thunderclap striking the very center of the camp. The pressure wave ripped the fire pit apart, violently hurling red-hot coals, ash, and jagged wooden shrapnel in a 10-foot radius. The tribe shrieked in absolute terror. Malachur, who had been standing too close, was caught in the blast wave. He was thrown backward off his feet, his staff splintering. He hit the dirt hard, gasping for breath, his face pelted with hot ash and soot. A ringing silence descended upon the canyon, broken only by the whimpering of the terrified elders. A crater now sat where the fire pit used to be. Cale stood up slowly, brushing a flake of ash from his shoulder. He walked over to the groaning shaman and placed the tip of his newly forged copper dagger against Malachur's throat. Your spirits are dead, Malachur, Cale whispered, his eyes entirely devoid of mercy. I killed them. Cale looked up at the tribe. They were trembling, staring at him as if he were a living god who held thunder in his hands. No more tricks. No more mud on wounds. No more starving in the dark. Cale's voice boomed across the camp. You will follow me. I will teach you the secrets of the earth. We will build furnaces that rival the sun, and we will forge weapons that will make the gods themselves bleed. Chief Throck stepped forward, his eyes wide with profound awe. He looked at the crater, then at Malachur cowering in the dirt, and finally at Cale. Slowly, the massive chief dropped his spear and pounded his fist to his chest in a salute of absolute submission. We hear you, crafter of thunder, Throck rumbled. Gore and the hunters immediately followed suit. Then Alara, and soon, the entire Blackrock tribe was kneeling in the dirt before a 15-year-old boy. Cale lowered his dagger. He had secured his labor force. Now, it was time to build an empire.